What's up YouTube? So today we are talking about processing your Psytrance bass. So this is going to follow on from the last two videos which I posted on my channel. One which is specifically how to create the actual Psytrance bass, and then another one which is kind of more informative about what disperser is, because I'm going to be using that tool in this video, or at least a couple of quite similar tools to achieve similar things. So the first segment of this video, I'm going to be following on from my Vital sound which we made in the previous tutorial, and I'm going to be using mainly Bitwig's built-in devices and effects and a couple of other tools to try and get the sound that we're looking for. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to show you why I think Phase Plant is specifically good for sound designing Psytrance bass lines, not only because you have really good control over your waveform design, but you can get your entire processing chain within just the plugin. So anyway, without blabbering too much, let's dive in and have a look. So this is a different project to the one that we were using in the previous video, but I've recreated the same bass line. I wanted to slow things down a little bit just so I could be a little bit more specific as to what's going on. I think it's a little bit easier to hear with slightly lower tempos to hear the kind of sound of the bass. Anyway, so you should have something very close to this if you followed the Vital bass tutorial. So for those who caught my video about disperser, you will know that disperser is basically a kind of multi-band simulation effect. And, you know, for those who have disperser, you could use it here. I generally tend to use it just because it's easier to kind of dial in the exact sound that we want for this kind of thing. So here, for example, we can turn the amount down to like 4, you know, to like somewhere around the mid-range. If you don't have disperser, you can get a very similar sound by using multiband FX3 and duplicating it. So then what I'll do is I'll actually put it on, slap on an oscilloscope and fine tune these frequencies until I get the sound that I'm looking for. Sometimes it's like a bit too pronounced, so then what we can do is we can go with a multiband FX2 and a multiband FX3. So what I'm generally looking for is a kind of waveform that looks similar to a kick, where it starts with a faster frequency and kind of slows down a little bit. You'll see though, however, when we start to enable these two multiband processes, we get a post-ringing, which is kind of just the nature of multiband processing, I guess. For example, in the patch, there is no overlap here onto the kick, but the more kind of EQ or multiband kind of processing that we add, it starts to add post-ringing, which not only adds some tail to the sound, but it also affects the amplitude over time. So like, for example, look how the first strike of the waveform is not as loud as the other ones. So it's kind of like reducing the amount of transient that we have to deal with the sound. There are ways around this though that I want to talk about. Okay, so first and foremost, you could either go this route. I'm actually going to add these to a group, and then we can disable this. Or like I said, disperser. I just find so much easier to quickly dial in the exact sound we're looking for. I usually just pop this anywhere in the mid-range, somewhere around there, and then just turn the amounts down to 4. It doesn't actually read out on the interface over here, but if we look at the bottom here, you can actually see 4 in Bitwig, amount 4. So do you see how the first strike of the waveform is significantly different to the rest? Obviously that's because of the post-ring effect that we have. So the way around this would be to render a single hit of this sound out and load it in as a wavetable, because then we can cycle through those different waveforms and actually choose the one we want, and it'll cycle that exact same waveform over and over again. So we can get the sound of disperser or a multiband effect, whichever one we choose, but with the stability of you know, cycling it over and over again in the wavetable. So I guess this is kind of back to sound design and not really processing, but the reason I left it for processing is because you can still get a good sound without it. You know, it's not kind of a necessity, but it's just something that's, you know, a lot more common nowadays in more modern Psytrance. So just for the sake of this tutorial, I know maybe some of you don't have disperser. Let's jump back to the effects layer that we made from the multiband stack, and we're going to render out a single note from Vital. So what I want to do is I actually just want to drop this here, and we can just make a clip over here, and we can just put in a long note like this. I want to turn up the channel volume to 0 or close to it, and then we can bounce this out as an audio file. It's important to choose post fader, that way you know that the effects are going to be applied to the sample, and you can double check by just zooming in and just confirming that it's not a saw wave, it's the actual waveform. So this is a C that we've rendered. So what we can do is we can open up this Vital again. Let's just disable the multiband processing that's happening over here. And then here what we can do is we can drag this sample into Vital and just hover over wavetable and then drop it like that. So now what we're going to want to do is we want to go in here, and actually in the window size, we're going to want to set something like C3. And you just want to confirm that the wavetable is the size like of the window. That doesn't quite look right. C2. Yeah, that's right. When you see that kind of like fluid movement like that, then you know you're at least in the right ballpark. Okay, so now we have that nice, interesting sound of the multiband, or the sound of disperser, but with the stability of having it like directly inside the synth. What I want to do is use this and change the position to something like, let's say, somewhere around there. That way we've kind of got, maybe we can actually move it in a bit. You see, so we've got this kind of like more fine control over the waveform, and we can cycle through that and see which one sounds the best. We've got this nice stable waveform. It cuts off when we need it to, and it won't overlap with the kick. That's even without any sidechain or anything like that. And we still got some tonal control here. If we just change this, it'll give us a little bit of tonal control, and we can still edit it further. So a couple of nice effects that I like to use are specifically like the bend and squeeze. You can get some interesting stuff this way. So essentially what the squeeze does is it basically shifts the balance of harmonics. For example, when you find the kind of sound that you want, but it's like a little bit too mid-range or something like that, you can squeeze it to the left and kind of shifts a little bit more to the kind of high frequency. So I also want to discuss another plugin that's recently come onto my radar thanks to Projector, who's another YouTuber. If you don't know Projector, you should definitely go check out his videos. So this plugin is M Freeform Phase. Essentially what this does is it kind of allows you to draw in your own phase rotation curves, which is pretty interesting. It's a bit finicky when using the traditional draw mode, so I would highly suggest right-clicking and just kind of unticking that box. So here what we can do is we can actually draw in something that's kind of like similar to what we saw in that phase response from Plugin Doctor in that previous video. So here what we can do, we can actually select both of these and move them together, which is pretty interesting. So what we could do is we can potentially draw in a couple of rotations and kind of just customize it ourselves. to create our own kind of shape this way. So like with the depth, I usually tune it down quite a bit. This one takes a little bit more, like I said, it's a little bit finicky. It takes a little bit more fine-tuning to kind of get the sound that you want. That being said, it's totally free and probably the most powerful because you can kind of do things outside of what you would usually expect. You know, even like if you add the draw mode as well, to do all sorts of weird things. You know, I wouldn't do this on a bass line, but, you know, maybe it works. Who knows? So you're probably also wondering at what point in this tutorial is he going to talk about compression and what compressor does he use on his Psytrance bass. And I kind of want to say that compression is a little bit unnecessary on bass, in my opinion, just because, you know, we have to evaluate why we would want to use compression. Most of the time compression is used to even out the amplitude of signals. So say, for example, we want to change... We have a very low volume bass note and a very high volume bass note, and we want to even those out closer together. Using something like compression is not actually the best way to do it, in my opinion. You either want to use velocity, because then you're changing the actual volume or amplitude of the notes at the source, or you want to use something like sidechain, which is just inevitably much cleaner way of controlling the volume and the amplitude of the sound, just because it gives you exact control over the peaks. So I want to show you a couple of examples. You know, I know a lot of you use LFO tool. I want to show you why I've started using Snap Heap for this recently. But then, you know, you could potentially just create something like this with almost any plugin. I mean, if we even just take something like Bitwig's built-in tool and we apply something like steps to the tool, give it 4 steps, we can create our own amplitude modulation like this way, you know, with just built-in plugins. But I want to make the case for Snap Heap real quick because, and I also want to show you my ideal shapes that I use. So here, for example, it's pretty easy to recreate something like LFO tool. We can actually just use something like the gain module, set it to percentage, turn it down all the way. Then what we can do is we can add in an LFO. So if we want this to trigger at a 1/4, we can put in something like this. And then we draw in our curve shape like this. And now if we set this to modulate this by, let's say, 50%, so that the maximum point is 100. So it goes from 0 to 100 gain. I've actually got this inside phase plant, so I'm just going to disable it here. So this is what we're dealing with now. So the reason I think that this is so powerful is we can get super meticulous with our modulations. And I want to show you the type of shape that I would generally use for my bass. So we want to go for something that's kind of stepped like this. However, big however, if you're using steps that are too brutal, there might be a little bit of a click. So what you're going to want to do is you're actually going to want to hold shift and just shift these ever so slightly so that it moves up just before the next note. Do you see that? And then now if we want to adjust it, we can actually just move these and select these both, hold control, and move this up or down. In terms of fine-tuning LFO tool or fine-tuning sidechain settings, this is the most exact. I mean, we can like dial into a resolution, we can zoom in here. You know, nothing else beats this. The fact that you can full screen it and everything, so cool. So the reason I do the shape like that, where it kind of scoops out that first note so distinctly, is so that you can get that really nice alignment, and each note is distinct. You know, the problem is if it's too much of a curve like this, you miss the transient, and then the body of the bass note suddenly gets a lot louder. So you want to stick to straight-ish lines when you're doing this kind of thing. And then quickly, if you just want to dial out the amount of sidechain that's happening, you can just turn this mix down over here. Okay, so let's look at some processing effects. Blackbox HG2 is a pretty decent saturator. Quite a lot of people rave about it. Look at what is happening here. Again, clean, you know, when we initiate the actual saturation in this plugin, look what happens. It kind of changes the skew of the sound. I like the tone that it has, but it vastly changes the sound and also changes the kind of like envelope of the sound because of that post-ringing. This is also sometimes the case with EQ if you're using cuts. So for example, I actually want to show you quickly, you know, a lot of people will say, you know, if you're making basses, you got a low cut so that you make sure that there's no sub rumble. You got a low cut at 20 Hertz. Okay, this is actually a bad example because Equilibrium is a really, really good EQ. I'm just going to use the stock EQ here in Bitwig, EQ2. So let's say, for example, put like a high pass. Do you see how that vastly changes the waveform, but not in a really pleasing way? So for example, we could use like a more high quality EQ. Most people would suggest setting the EQ to something like linear phase mode, because you would get less of that difference in the waveform. So here, for example, we could set this to linear phase mode. The problem then is you have that pre or post ringing. You see that? Now it's actually changed the waveform even more. The actual waveform itself is retained, but you get a change in the envelope of the sound. You see that? So Equilibrium actually has a thing called full minimum, which is better than linear phase, but it's still not quite there. You see, there's no pre-ringing, but there is only post-ringing. Still, it affects the sound. However, we don't need to actually do any low cutting, in my opinion, because we're synthesizing the bass, we're choosing the exact frequency domain which it can exist in. So it's actually more important to get the correct envelope, like the decay, sustain, and release settings on your bass, because then you're choosing the amount of time that the bass occupies in the track, as opposed to the amount of amplitude that that specific frequency has. Then if it changes notes, it's all, the balance is different. So it's actually more important to just sound design your bass correctly than to bother about EQing it correctly. That being said, sometimes there's a couple of reasons why you would want to, for example, remove some mid-range, some lower mids and stuff like that, or maybe even boost some high frequencies in your bass sound. So here, for example, let's add this black box in again. So we're adding a little bit of saturation. I actually want to put this is basically LFO tool, or any kind of sidechain tool will work there. I want to put that after the oscilloscope. And so the black box sounds really good, although I feel like it's adding a little bit too much of that kind of mid-range. So maybe around kind of 200 Hertz. So here in this example, instead of using the EQ as a kind of mix tool, I'm using it more as a kind of sound design tool, taking into account that I'm going to resample it and load it back into the oscillator as a wavetable. Because of that whole idea of pre-post ringing, I want to get the sound to be as stable as possible. But we're just using all these tools to kind of get the tone that we want. So consider this, instead post-processing, consider this tone shaping. So what I usually do is I will use the EQ and the saturation and stuff too, rather than like listen to how it sounds. You look at an oscilloscope and look at how the balance of that waveform changes. So let me disable and enable these plugins and notice how with them, it kind of feels like the waveform is more of a sausage. I guess that's a bad term because it's a kind of derogatory term, if you know what I mean. But like in a good way, the kind of dynamics of the sound are a lot more stable. Okay, so when you've got it sounding good, what I want to do is I want to render out a sample. So here what I want to do is I want to disable the filter, and I want to disable the snap heap and any kind of other time-based processing that's happening. And then we can put in a kind of long single note. Look at all that post-ringing from that saturation plugin. Holy shit, that's unbelievable. Okay, so we drop it in, punch in the, should be the same note, I think C2. Looks about right. Let's shorten it over here so we've got a little bit more fine-tuned control. Perfect. And so now we can actually disable the squeeze, because it should be the sound that we want with that, because it kind of rendered it out with that effect. Does that make sense? And then re-enable the filter. Okay, so we might have to re-enable, okay, LFO tool, I've done that. Let's have a listen to what we've created now. So you're probably wondering, you know, why I chose to do the tone shaping outside of Vital. That's because of the kind of, I would say, one downside about Vital, in that you can't change the harmonic balance of waveforms that you've loaded in as audio files. So it's just, I guess, the one downside. It would be really cool if they could make a thing which kind of rendered audio files to normal tables. Do you know what I mean? So that you could change the harmonic balance. I know Serum does it. For those who have Serum, what you could do is you could potentially take this waveform, load it into Serum, change the balance, load it back into Vital if you want. Or you could potentially just create the whole thing in something like Serum. However, there's the one downside of needing that external process of like multiband or something like that. So that brings me to the next section of the video, which is why I generally prefer phase plant for my sound designing of bass nowadays, if I want to get kind of more advanced. Because there's a couple of things directly in the wavetable which negate having to do this whole lengthy process of resampling and loading back in and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so I'm not going to go through creating this entire preset in the video. You can pretty much guess how it's done. I guess if you understand synthesis, or if you've seen any of my other previous phase plant videos, I've got a couple on how to do bass lines. What I will do though is I will upload this bass preset to my Patreon for all my $5 supporters. So for those who want to kind of jump in here and sound design from this as a starting point, I'm going to upload this one to my Patreon, as well as some of the kind of finished bass sounds that we create today. So anyway, like I was saying, I think one of the most powerful things in phase plant is the ability not only to get your entire kind of rack of processing done directly in the actual synth itself, so you won't really need any other stuff on the chain. What you could also potentially do is you can load audio files as wavetables and then further edit their harmonic balance, which I think is, you know, one of the reasons why, you know, the kind of buck stops a little bit in Vital and you need that external processing. But then another really cool thing is, you know, obviously Kilohearts makes disperser, they make phase plant as well. There is a disperser mode directly in the wavetable editor. So Vital also has, you know, one of the spectral modes is phase disperse, but it kind of sounds quite different to the regular disperse that we know of. And you also can't write it to the table and then further edit it, if you know what I mean. It still requires that render. So anyway, look at the control that we have here. If, say, for example, we use the disperse mode, it doesn't actually commit it to the sound until we actually press this done button. So I guess it's similar to Vital in the fact that it's non-destructive up unto a point. So you can do similar things with modulating the amount of dispersion that happens over these kind of keyframes here, for example. So at the beginning we can say like a low amount, and then at the end over here we can say a kind of high amount. So notice how when we then sweep through the wavetable, we get that varying dispersion amount. Obviously, like, that gets way too far. We're not going to go anywhere near that amount. Take this into account, that we have that control. So we can create wavetables where we have these kind of sweeping phase values, which is really, really interesting. So like I said, you know, the power of phase plant is we can do our entire processing chain directly in the plugin. You know, like I said, I've remade my kind of LFO tool inside Snapheap, and one of the reasons is because I can just load that inside phase plant and just save this as a preset. You know what I mean? Okay, so remember what I was saying about being able to kind of change the harmonic balance of the sound. I want to show you where it gets really interesting in Phase Plant. Like I said, we can kind of edit the harmonic values that we have here. So, for example, if you look at how the phase dispersion treats the frequency balance of the sound, it doesn't change at all. It's just the phase of each sound. So we can potentially edit this wavetable here with the harmonic edit tool, this one over here, and we can just drag down either of these harmonics to change, to potentially EQ the sound, change the balance of how we want it. But I want to show you folks something incredibly interesting here. Let's say, for example, we want to create a split. So here we can say this is going to be the sub layer. We can duplicate this. And then in this layer, let's open the harmonic edit tool. So what we're going to have to do is actually remove it like this. And then go over to the last one and remove it here as well. And then press done. And now it should give us the entire sweep's worth of just the lowest fundamental frequency. Obviously, because there's 2 keyframes, we only have to remove those 2 keyframes worth of data. I want to undo that, duplicate the layer, call this one sublayer, and then we can just quickly redo that. And this one is going to be bin 2 and 3, and then this is going to be all of the other ones. So with this one, we don't want the fundamental. We want 2 and 3, and all of the rest of them we don't want. So now it's just that sweep of the dispersion that we have bin 2 and 3. And then with this one, we want to remove 1, 2, and 3. And we must remember to do the last keyframe as well. So now we've essentially recreated the sound, but we've got individual control over the fundamental or the sub frequency, the low mids, and the upper frequencies. In fact, we can confirm this by just soloing the sub frequencies. Okay, so I want to bring up the elephant in the room because I know that pretty much all of these Psytrance-based tutorials, including my own, will talk about correcting the phase at some point. And a lot of you are probably wondering, like, why would you distort the phase in such a way if you want to actually get it to line up correctly? And so that's why I kind of want to distinguish 2 different types of working with the phase. I want to say that there is a more creative side of working with phase. Let's call this phase distortion, because I guess it's similar to something like using distortion. You wouldn't use distortion while mixing the track. But distortion can be a very powerful tool in sound design. Do you know what I mean? While then there is phase correction, which is less useful in sound design, but way more useful in mixing the track and making sure that your bass and kick align nicely. So tools like disperser, freeform phase, and these kinds of things might not be the best in terms of phase alignment, but taking into account the thing I was talking about within Phase Plant, where you can actually split the oscillators so that you have the subs or fundamental as a single oscillator, that is actually, in my opinion, the best way to phase align something, because technically you only have to phase align that lowest fundamental. You don't have to worry about any other frequencies, because that lowest fundamental is going to be the only one that's going to clash with the kick. And then on top of that, what we can do is we can potentially just mute the low mids and the auxiliary bins so we have just the sub playing. And then when we look at this on an oscilloscope, you can see that we have only the fundamental of the bass showing up on an oscilloscope. So this allows us to actually line it up perfectly with the kick. You see that? So like, have you ever seen such perfect phase alignment? I guess it's so easy because it's just 2 sine waves that you have to, line up. And how I would do that is literally in the plugin. Just change the phase over here. So you're probably wondering, why doesn't that change the sound? It's because we've separated the layers. Do you know what I mean? We don't necessarily have to have all of these layers on the same phase, but as long as the top layers have that transient point, you'll be okay. I guess with the bottom layer, it's more about aligning it with the kick. could also potentially offset the phase by using the frame position. Okay, so I want to talk about EQ also a little bit further. Remember what I was saying about how it's actually better to adjust your envelopes rather than to try and use a EQ to cut lows so that it balances better in the mix. A couple of reasons why I believe this. So an EQ is basically dealing with a specific frequency, let's say, for example. And let's say this note that we're doing, for argument's sake, is around like 50 hertz. And then we apply a low cut to try and remove some of the subs. First and foremost, the fundamental is at 50 hertz. So to remove anything subby from that, the cut would have to be above 50 hertz. And therefore, it's just changing the amplitude of the sound, of the fundamental. Therefore, reducing the overall amount of bass and not reducing the amount of time that the bass spends in the mix, which I think is actually most important. So if we want to get a nice punchy bass sound, rather than trying to reduce the amount of sub with a low cut, it's actually better to just reduce the amount of subs by changing the decay and sustain setting on the low frequencies. So I think the best example I can make is if we remove, again, like remove the highs from this bass, and let's say we just listen to that sub. Then let's say put on an EQ over here and do a low cut, or like a lot of production tutorials will tell you. And then let's see if we can kind of fine tune this to get a good sound. You'll see at some point, suddenly that bass is going to disappear. If we think about loudness, loudness is a value determined by the amount of time which something spends being played, like in the mix. So let's say, for example, we just reduce the sustain of this instrument. Do you hear how immediately it already sounds like the mix of the low end is better? The bass isn't as rumbly, but we still have that nice punchy transient. We haven't just completely removed the lows with an EQ. So this idea compounds, especially when we start splitting the oscillators like we've done in phase plant, because we can still leave these mid-range and high frequencies full sustain. So they get a nice long body in the note, but the low frequency isn't too rumbly. Or vice versa, if there's too much body in the sound, we can reduce the sustains in the higher registers and increase the sustain in the low register, or set it back to default, you know what I mean? So the whole issue that I find with EQs, like I said, with low cuts specifically, isn't really present in peak nodes that are not too low in frequency. So let's say, for example, between like 200 and up, I generally use EQs to fit the bass better into the context of the mix here. So let's say, for example, this kick drum is very mid-heavy, and we want the bass to fit a little bit better with the kick drum. We could remove just a little bit of the mids from the bass with very specific cuts. Maybe not even go that extreme, you know. So EQ I would use a little bit, but more in the mix side of things, less in the sound design side of things, to kind of more fit this bass into the context rather than to try and make the bass sound better. Does that make sense? So at this part, sometimes I might find that the bass is lacking a little bit of this transient. It's not in this case. In this case, it's actually too much. In those cases where it might be lacking, I would just boost a little bit of these high frequencies over here. But in this case, I feel like it's a little bit too much. So I've just reduced it a little bit. And so here, if you want to get like really fancy, what we could potentially do is set it up so that the subs and the low mids send to lane 2, and then the aux bins send to lane 1. And then here, for example, we could apply some stereo effects or something like that to kind of widen the sound a little bit. And this lane's effects won't be applied to the subs or to the low mids, only to the high frequency layers. On top of that, we could potentially also add some extra stuff like transient shaping and that kind of stuff that we would potentially do with multiband processing. You know what I mean? So with this, we've kind of skipped the idea of multiband and actually split the sound up into like an additive method, and we can actually process each of these bins individually if we need. So again, for example, here what we could do is put this, you know, entire filter for the sound onto the last bus. Here, set this to send to lane 3. And then this one, the subs can actually go directly to lane 3. Low mids can be over here. We can add some kind of saturation here. So let's add a distortion, set this over to saturate mode, and then we can dial this in ever so slightly. I usually like to turn the DC filter off. So bear in mind here, because there's no kind of gain compensation in this distortion, we're actually going to have to reduce it afterwards. And then we can use this to kind of balance the frequency spectrum back again. Do you see how much tonal control here we have here without completely changing the preset? You know, often I find when you have to stack too much processing after the fact, you can't really just dive in there and mess with the preset to the fact that you can kind of change it to this point, you know. So here, for example, we could set up a bunch of macros so that we could vastly change the sound as we need. I'm going to upload this to my Patreon for all my $5 supporters. That's about it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. I will see you guys next time. Cheers.